What's up, biology students? It's Mr. Holloway here with another video about human anatomy and physiology. And today we're going to learn about the nervous system and the endocrine system, two systems in our body that are involved with sending messages around and processing information and ultimately issuing responses to the various changes that are happening inside and outside of our body. But they send messages in two very different ways, and I'd like to begin with an analogy to help you understand the difference between how these two systems send messages. So the nervous system is a very targeted messaging system. That's a lot like sending an email. It goes to one particular person or maybe a couple of particular people. The endocrine system is more like a broadcast messaging system, more like television or radio. And anybody who's got a television or radio can receive one of those kinds of messages. And in the endocrine system inside of our body, any cell that has the right kind of receptors can receive a message sent by the endocrine system. We're going to begin today by talking about the nervous system. And the nervous system is like the command center of our body. It collects information about the body's internal and external environment using the five senses. It processes and filters this information. It sort of thinks about it, and then it issues a response to this stimulus. It ultimately tells our body how to respond to whatever changes are happening inside or outside of our body. Some of this stuff is under our conscious control. Some of this stuff is under our unconscious control and sort of just happens automatically. And we can break the nervous system up into two primary parts. There's the central nervous system, made of the brain and spinal cord, and then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of all the other nerves in our body that branch off of the spinal cord. And these two parts of the nervous system are in continual communication with one another. For example, the peripheral nervous system gathers information and sends it to the central nervous system. The central nervous system processes this information and formulates a response. And then it sends this response out to the peripheral nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system carries this response to the right part of the body, maybe some muscles or some glands or something like that. And we can subdivide the nervous system into even more sort of specific categories based on what those specific parts of our nervous system are responsible for doing inside of our body. So for example, we just talked about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And these two parts of our nervous system are connected by the spinal cord, which is why they're able to be in constant communication with one another. In the peripheral nervous system, that's made up of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And the difference between those two things is that the somatic nervous system is under our conscious control. We think about stuff and then we make it happen. As with me talking to you right now, I'm thinking about it and my somatic nervous system is sending out the impulses to make that happen. The autonomic nervous system handles the stuff that we don't have to think about, so it's under our unconscious control. It controls the beating of our heart and the blinking of our eyelids and the expansion and contraction of our lungs due to the contraction of the diaphragm. Things like that that we don't have to think about, that just happen automatically, are under the control of our autonomic nervous system. Every now and then, though, our autonomic nervous system takes over for our somatic nervous system by way of this thing called the reflex arc. So when our body recognizes that whatever stimulus it's receiving is dangerous for the body, the reflex arc takes over and makes something happen without us really having to think about it. And a good example of that is when we touch something really, really hot. When we touch something really, really hot, our body recognizes that as being a damaging factor, and instead of sending that information all the way up to our brain for our brain to think about before we respond, the autonomic nervous system just takes over and pulls our hand away. And that happens by way of the reflex arc. And that ultimately helps to keep us safe. It's sort of like a backup mechanism to make sure that we don't damage our body. And then the autonomic nervous system can be broken up into the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. And these two parts of our body are sort of involved with gearing us up and slowing us down. So for example, when you exercise, your sympathetic nervous system speeds up your heart so that it can more efficiently deliver oxygen to all of the parts of the body that need it, and need it more often because they're exercising. When we're done exercising and our body recognizes that we don't need our heart to be beating as fast anymore, our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and it slows our heart back down again. And we can think of these two parts of our nervous system as being complementary to one another. On the one hand, it speeds us up. On the other hand, it slows us back down. And the brain is kind of in control of it all, especially the things that we have to think about. And the brain is made up of three primary regions. We've got the brain stem down here at the bottom, and that handles all of our body basics. It handles the beating of our heart and our breathing and our blinking and all that stuff. We've got the cerebellum, which helps us coordinate movement. And then everything else falls under the category of the cerebrum. And as you can see, there are a lot of different parts of the cerebrum, and each part of the cerebrum is responsible for kind of a particular aspect of our physiology. For example, the temporal lobe is responsible for language, the occipital lobe is responsible for vision, and damage to any one of these areas can impede whatever aspect of our physiology that part of the brain is responsible for. For example, damage to the parietal lobe affects our ability to move around. Damage to the frontal lobe affects our ability to plan for the future. Damage to some of these other parts of our cerebrum might damage our ability to think logically and to make good decisions about things. Other parts of our brain that are responsible for our basic emotions or forming memories, if we damage those, that's going to affect our ability to form memories and to emote properly. And this part in the middle of our brain here, called the corpus callosum, is the part that connects the two halves of our brain. And you've probably heard somebody at some point in your life talk about how they are very, very right-brained or very left-brained, depending on what it is they'd like to do with their lives. In truth, we're all using both halves of our brain all the time, and both halves of our brain are connected and are in communication with one another by way of the corpus callosum. So our brain is made up of nervous tissue, but it's a lot more than just a lump of nervous tissue, and there's a lot of aspects to how the brain does things like form memories and decides how to form an emotional response that are still very much a mystery to us. The brain is more than just the sum of its parts. Consciousness, for example, is something that's really not very well understood. We don't really understand how this mass of nervous tissue is capable of forming a distinct personality like each one of us has. So it's an area of continual research, and we're trying to figure it out, and in fact we are figuring it out slowly. But for now, at least, we know that all of these different parts of the brain are in charge of different aspects of who we are. And the basic unit of the nervous system is this kind of cell called a neuron. And we have three kinds of neurons in our body. We have sensory neurons. Those are the neurons that are gathering information using our five senses. We have motor neurons, and those are neurons that are in charge of communicating with our muscles in order to produce movement. And then we've got interneurons, and interneurons are pathways, and they're the decision makers. They decide where to send that information in our brain so that an appropriate response can be formulated. And you may notice that a neuron has a very particular shape to it. It kind of reminds me of a tree, and we've got roots at one end and the canopy of the tree at the other end. And that sort of canopy area over here that we call the cell body, that's the part of a neuron that's responsible for receiving messages. And messages enter a neuron through these things that we call the dendrites. And if enough of our dendrites are stimulated, then the cell body will decide, okay, we need to send a message on to the next neuron in the row, and that signal will be sent down this long shaft called the axon. And at the end of that axon are all of these axon terminals that then connect this neuron to a bunch of other neurons, so that then we can continue to send that signal wherever it needs to go, to the next neuron and the next one after that, and so forth. Now, our nervous system is able to send messages via an electrical impulse. Very literally, electricity is traveling through our neurons, which is why it travels so fast around our body. And we can see here in this graph some important information about how that happens. So, I'm going to point out some important aspects of this graph that I want you to be aware of. First of all, we should notice that in this part of the graph, this is what we call resting potential. So when our neurons are not being stimulated. And when our neurons are not being stimulated, the inside of them is negatively charged. However, when our neurons are stimulated, positively charged ions start to flow into our neurons, and that makes the inside of our neurons more positively charged. Now, unless this is a very big stimulus, we might just get a failed initiation, where maybe we get a little bit of a stimulus and a little bit of an electrical charge change within our neuron, but not really enough to do anything, so our body ignores it. But when our body gets a big enough stimulus in one of our neurons, all of these gates start to open and a whole bunch of positively charged particles flow into our neurons, and that creates what's called an action potential, where suddenly things are flipped around, and suddenly, rather than being negatively charged, the inside of our cell becomes positively charged. What we're seeing in this graph is basically happening in one tiny little slice of that axon, and when it happens in that slice, it stimulates the next piece of our axon to go through the same process, and that nervous impulse is then transmitted through the length of our axon and out through the axon terminals to the next neuron in the row. And we can kind of see that happening here in this animated GIF, where we see a stimulus coming in through the dendrites, an electrical impulse or an action potential being sent along the axon, and then out through the axon terminals at the end. Now, when that signal reaches the end of one neuron, it reaches this area called a synapse. And a synapse is basically just the space between one neuron and the next. And in order for that signal to be carried from one neuron to the next, we have to use these things called neurotransmitters, which we can see here in our picture. So when our electrical impulse reaches the end of an axon terminal, all of these little vesicles, which contain these neurotransmitters, are stimulated to merge with the cell membrane and thereby release those neurotransmitters into the synapse, into the area between these two neurons. They diffuse across that synapse and bind with receptors on ion channels on the next neuron. That stimulates these ion channels to open up, and charged particles are then able to diffuse into the neuron, and the process happens all over again. In this video here, we can see those signals being sent around the nervous system, and they're being sent ridiculously fast. It's a very, very, very fast response that the nervous system is capable of. And here we can see all of those charged particles diffusing in and out of our neurons, and ultimately that's what sends the electrical signal along the length of our axon from the cell body down to the end of the axon and ultimately on to the next neuron in the row. Here we can see that electrical impulse reaching the end of one neuron, and we can see all those vesicles filled with neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters are diffusing across the synapse and binding with receptors on the opposite side, and that causes some new channels to open up, and we get some charged particles then diffusing in through those channels. And this will start the whole process over again in the next neuron. And if that next neuron is properly stimulated and gets above its threshold, it too will send an electrical impulse down the length of the axon and then on to the next neuron after that. Now, the endocrine system sends messages in a very, very different way. And the endocrine system sends messages using these compounds called hormones. And that's the first main important function of the endocrine system, to secrete hormones. These hormones make their way into the blood, bind with the appropriate cells, initiate the appropriate changes in those cells, and that's how the endocrine system sends messages. And ultimately, the endocrine system, as a result, is very much responsible for regulating our internal environment. Our endocrine system is kind of spread out all over the place, and we have endocrine glands virtually throughout our body. There are endocrine glands in our brain, including the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, and the pituitary gland. There are endocrine glands in our throat and chest, including the thyroid and parathyroid glands, as well as the thymus. There are endocrine glands on our kidneys. The adrenal glands, for example, kind of live on top of our kidneys. Our pancreas is an endocrine gland. In fact, our kidneys themselves secrete some hormones that are responsible for stimulating red blood cell production. The ovaries and testes are two important endocrine glands that secrete hormones that control our sexual development. And then there's a lot of other organs around the body that contain endocrine cells, like the heart, liver, and stomach, the small intestine, and like we said, the kidneys. And these contain some cells that might excrete some hormones, but they themselves are not necessarily considered to be a gland per se. And remember at the beginning, I said that the endocrine system sends messages very much like a broadcast system that we are familiar with, like television or radio. And here's how it does that. So a secreting cell somewhere in the body, say in one of these glands that we just talked about, secretes a hormone that makes its way into the bloodstream. There, it can be circulated all around the body. And when those hormones reach the target cells, cells with either the right receptors or the right kind of machinery inside of them, that hormone is then going to initiate some sort of cellular response. For example, steroid hormones, which are made of a cholesterol, are able to pass directly through cell membranes. And that's because cholesterols are lipids. The cell membrane is made of lipids, so those two molecules are compatible with one another, and steroid hormones can diffuse right across a cell membrane. So they diffuse into the cell, they bond with some kind of receptor inside of the cell, and that hormone receptor complex then makes its way to the nucleus. And a lot of these steroid hormones are involved with regulating gene expression. Remember, to express a gene means that first we take a piece of DNA and we transcribe it into a piece of RNA. That piece of RNA leaves the nucleus and is translated via protein synthesis into a protein. And that protein, maybe it's an enzyme or something like that, alters this function of that cell in some way. And that process is stimulated by the presence of this steroid hormone. But we also have these things called non-steroid hormones. And non-steroid hormones are a little bit different because they're not able to cross the cell membrane. Because they're not made of lipids, they have to bind with receptors that are embedded in the cell membrane. But they bind with that receptor, and that generally initiates some sort of enzyme activity inside of the cell. That enzyme activity often initiates or activates some sort of secondary messenger. That secondary messenger goes and initiates or activates some more enzymes to do some other thing inside of the cell that ultimately leads to altered cellular function as well. And these non-steroid hormones aren't really involved with gene expression so much, but they do affect whatever that cell is doing and initiate changes in that cell that our body deems are necessary at the time. And when it comes to hormones and when it comes to the endocrine system, it's all about balance. And in most cases, we've got sort of complementary set of hormones that balance each other out. And we talked already a little bit about these two hormones called epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And this is a good example of how these two hormones balance each other out. So on the one hand, we've got epinephrine, which speeds up our body and gets us ready for vigorous exercise or to run away from a predator or something like that. It puts us on high alert. And then we've got this other hormone called norepinephrine that slows us back down and brings us back down to that relaxing place that we were before the adrenaline rush happened. Two hormones that regulate our blood sugar are complementary to one another like this. And those two hormones are insulin and glucagon. Now let's sort of walk through this cycle here. When our body senses that we've got high blood sugar, that promotes insulin production in the pancreas. And the pancreas releases that insulin out into the bloodstream. That stimulates the uptake of glucose from the blood. And our liver converts that glucose into glycogen, which is, well, we call it animal starch. It's like a storage molecule for blood sugar. And that effectively lowers our blood sugar because all of that sugar, all of that glucose is being taken out of our blood and being packaged up into this molecule called glycogen, which we can see here. Now, when our blood sugar is low, because we just took a bunch of glucose out and packaged it up in some glycogen, or maybe because we haven't eaten in a long time or something like that, that promotes the release of glucagon. And glucagon which is also produced by the pancreas, stimulates the breakdown of glycogen, turning glycogen back into glucose, which ultimately raises our blood sugar. And then when our body senses that we have high blood sugar, that promotes the release of insulin. Insulin stimulates the formation of glycogen by stimulating the uptake of glucose from our blood. That causes our blood sugar to lower. And then when our blood sugar gets too low, once again, that promotes the release of glucagon into our system, and the cycle starts all over again. So these two hormones, once again, are balancing each other out. And the same thing happens in the thyroid system. The thyroid system is principally responsible for controlling our metabolism. And the way that that one works is that we've got this organ, or this gland called the hypothalamus up in our brain, and that releases a hormone that we're going to just call TRH. This hormone, TRH, stimulates the pituitary gland to produce another hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates, you guessed it, the thyroid gland to produce some other hormones called T3 and T4. And T3 and T4 are the hormones ultimately that are responsible for regulating our metabolism. But when our body senses that we've got a lot of that T3 and T4 floating around, that creates a negative feedback loop which inhibits the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And because they've been inhibited, they stop releasing TRH and they stop releasing TSH, and that basically stops the thyroid gland from producing these thyroid hormones. But then when our body senses that those thyroid hormones are in short supply, that then shuts down this negative feedback loop, and then that stimulates the hypothalamus to begin releasing TRH. That stimulates the pituitary to start releasing TSH, which stimulates the thyroid gland to start releasing T3 and T4. And that then kicks in the negative feedback mechanism again, and so forth. So all of these hormones are balancing each other out once again, so that our body maintains a stable internal environment, and none of these systems get sort of out of control. And hormones are really important for controlling our development and our growth from children into adults. And in this part of life that we call puberty, a whole bunch of new hormones are being released into the body, and those stimulate all kinds of things. Those same sets of hormones also initiate the development of what we call secondary sexual characteristics in both males and females. In males, for example, it's going to stimulate the growth of facial hair, the deepening of the voice, and the development of pubic hair and mature genitals. In females, similar sorts of things happen, but in females, they grow breasts, their hips grow wider, and they start to menstruate. So basically, during all of these hormonal changes, our body is transforming us from children into sexually mature adults. And hormones are particularly important for regulating the female reproductive cycle. And we can see here in this table a bunch of different figures that illustrate how the menstrual cycle works. So up here at the top, we've got a bunch of different kinds of hormones. Here in the middle, we show the development of this thing called a follicle, which ultimately is the structure that releases an egg into the female reproductive cycle. And then down at the bottom of this figure, we see changes in the uterine lining over the course of this cycle. So, some important things that you should recognize from this figure are the relationships between when these hormones are most abundant and key changes that are happening in a woman during the menstrual cycle. For example, when this thing called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, is in high concentration, you guessed it, that stimulates the development of a follicle, and we can see here that our follicle is just starting to grow, and that will eventually release an egg into the female reproductive tract. At the same time, when follicle stimulating hormone is peaking, that's sort of resetting the female reproductive cycle, and that's when menstruation occurs, as the female body is shedding the old uterine lining and preparing to grow a new one. Here we can see that as the levels of estrogen start to rise, that the uterine lining is also starting to increase. And right here, where we have a peak in this hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH, that's when the follicle, or the egg, is released. And at this point, a woman is fertile. That egg could be fertilized and could grow into an embryo and ultimately into a new human being. Later on in the cycle, we see this peak in a hormone called progesterone. And progesterone peaks when the uterine lining is at its maximum. And shortly after that, when that progesterone level starts to fall off, the uterine lining starts to shed, menstruation begins, and the cycle begins all over again with a new peak in follicle-stimulating hormone and the development of a new follicle. All right, that's it for our video today. Feel free to go back and watch this video as many times as you need to make sure you understand the concepts and picked up on all of the important vocabulary. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk a little bit more about this stuff the next time I see you in class.